Welcome to this Lit in 5 video on the language use in Carol Ann Duffy's The Laughter of Stafford Girls High. These are my favourite videos to make because I believe these give you maximum benefit in terms of boosting your grades and attainment. The ability to zoom in close and identify and then analyse a writer's use of language in terms of their possible intentions and the possible effects, a highly prized skill in your A-level examinations and your coursework. This is quite a lengthy video. It is, after all, quite a lengthy poem. But coming up, I have 5 areas or types of language I've identified which I think are crucial to unlocking some key aspects of the poem. So here we have 5 areas or types of language which I've identified throughout the poem, which I'm now going to go into a lot of detail and show you examples and zoom in close on sections of the poem, all to benefit your AO1/2 analysis. So your argument, your AO1, which has to be supported by analysis of the writer's techniques. The forthcoming discussion will not mean as much to you if you haven't listened to the context video and the form and structure video, so be sure you check those 2 out in the recommended order before you come to this language video, but obviously you can revisit these as many times as you need. So let's dive into the first one here. We're going clockwise, so our first one we're going to be looking at is imagery of repression/order versus disruption and release. Please note that even though we're going to be looking at 5 different slides here with 5 different areas of language to analyse, please be aware that when we're looking at number 1, there could easily be moments in the quotations or the techniques we look at which applies to 5 or 4. Equally, when we look at 2, those quotes could also speak to 5 and 1 and 3. These all interrelate, but I'm sure you're aware of that, and you'll be good enough as a student to embrace that depending on the question you've been set and the focus you would need to show. Moving clockwise through our quotations here, we zoom in on the first one. Looking at one of the pupils here, Rosemary Beth, the brace on whose jiggly teeth couldn't restrain the gulping giggle she gave, which caused Miss Dunn to spin around. An important bit of symbolism there with the brace, symbol being an object that stands in for a bigger or a wider idea. A brace is there to restrain, to hold in shape, to hold together. Despite that, obviously she's wearing a brace to correct her teeth, but the symbolism or the symbolic nature of that item shows a struggle to stifle. You can see there it couldn't restrain the gulping giggle. As we explored in the context video, the laughter is an extended metaphor for the rise of feminism and rebellion. Even the word gulp, it could also link to the idea of water, of course. I know you can gulp air, but you can also gulp water. So we explore that with our nature imagery as well. Moving clockwise, we come to this quote. We see another pupil here, Geraldine Ruth, and we notice how her lips split from the closed bud of a kiss to the daisy chain of a grin, and then how she yodeled a laugh at the full open blooming rose of her throat, a flower of merriment. So very important language here in the idea of release and sort of disruption built in with that. We see this filtered through Duffy's use of nature language here as well, something we explore in a later part of the video, but we can see how the lips split from the closed bud of a kiss and broadens out to a beautiful natural daisy chain of a grin. She's also finding her voice here as well. You'll notice the word yodel there. She yodeled a laugh with the full open blooming rose of her throat. Very important metaphor there as well. Please notice full and open also, very important in terms of the idea of release and the pleasure and enjoyment which comes from this hilarity. Notice also just above that as well, Geraldine Ruth is sort of colourless and grey, her face to puce, suddenly gifted with health and youth, as though invisible crayons seem to colour her in. Definitely getting the idea of a coming of age here, of an identity emerging. Someone who was grey and nondescript earlier now is coloured in and has a personality and an individuality. In this moment, for one of the pupils, we are undoubtedly seeing the enabling benefits of feminism here, obviously represented through the extended metaphor of laughter, and what it does for Geraldine Ruth. It gives her a place, it gives her identity, it gives her a voice, you can see from Yodeled, and it's represented through nature imagery in a way which suggests it is both natural and beautiful. At this stage, however, we can see the voice of the teacher there in juxtaposition with that. What's the big joke? Well, that's the point that Caroline Duffy is raising here. The teachers do not see the joke. They are not yet able to embrace this free-spirited nature caused by the laughter and hilarity of the emerging and spreading feminism. On that point of teacher repression, we'll just move around to this very small quote here. There are numerous examples of this, but just a very short, quick one. The tight-lipped Senora devises. So, in contrast to what we've just seen with Geraldine Ruth, whose lips split from that closed bud, to the contrasting idea of full and open. See those antitheses there of closed and open. At this stage of the poem, we still have the teachers very repressed and restrained, so the tight-lipped Senora devises. As the poem moves on, however, we do see this idea of release from repression start to spread across to the teachers, particularly when we move from their public sphere identity of a professional teacher to their private lives. That's obviously something we're afforded from the third person omniscient perspective that the poem is written in. However, structurally these two stanzas are very important. So the shift from this stanza to the next stanza, moving from the snowball and the pupils to how the teacher regards the snowball, very important structurally as well. I think it's a really effective piece of symbolism here, or some metaphor, or a symbolic metaphor if you want to really go to town on AO2. We have the snowball. The snowball is obviously something that gathers momentum, it grows in size and heft, and this is something that the pupils are rolling outside. But we also see here how a teacher notices it for the first time. So Miss Bat vacantly staring down as their class wrote out a list, of course, alphabetical, very boring, very uninspiring. She noticed the snowball, huge and alone, startlingly white in the pencily grey of the light. Obviously this gets towards the idea of the sterility and the boredom of this climate and this atmosphere. And thought of desire, of piano scales slowing, breasts, very jarring juxtaposition of words there. It's deliberately meant to stand out, this reference to the female body. So her mind has wandered, almost as though it's never wandered into this territory before, and certainly not in school. So we have she moaned aloud, forgetful of where she was. We also see here how a pupil then mirrors or apes or copies her teacher. Francesca Eve echoed the moan, the class roared. So we're getting towards that idea of a sort of contagious release as well. The teachers are feeding off the pupils and their chaos and fun and joy, and then the teacher has a sort of a reverie, a daydream, an erotic sort of reverie, lets out a moan, and then that just sets the class off yet again. So they definitely are feeding off each other here. Structurally, the stanza then progresses into the private life of two of the teachers, and obviously we have the unleashing of desire here late on in this quote. Just backtracking to an important bit of symbolism there as well, much in the way that we had the brace, which is meant to control and correct and keep things in order. The little mention here of opening the wine with the corkscrew from last year's school trip to Siena and Florence. So There is a pleasure that has been deferred or held or not enjoyed, and even the idea of a cork is something symbolic of restraint. To uncork something is to release it, of course, and in the case of wine, it's to release the joy of having a nice glass of red or whatever it is. But it's interesting we're seeing that patterning of symbolic items of repression being released or struggling or failing to contain and restrain here. Still moving clockwise, we come to further evidence of repression, this time within the loveless and dull and uninspiring marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Mackay. If you notice these adjectives here, ordered, precise, almost synonyms really in this instance for boredom and dull routine, nothing of excitement at all. We have here a line of dialogue which seems to accompany Mr. Mackay every time he eats his fish. A very nice dish from the bottomless deep. He's obviously meant to be a character who you loathe and are meant to consider as being insufferable to spend your life with. But we have here bad words ran in her head like mice. She wanted to write them down in the crossword lights. So notice here how this isn't expressed. She wants to let her frustrations out. I'll leave it to your own imagination what she wants to put, beginning with F, in each of the clues there. But it's important that this as yet isn't said. And you'll notice that she bit her lip. So there's another instance of containing and repressing. In the case of Mrs. Mackay, this is extremely damaging to her sanity and her overall fate at the end of the poem. You'll notice there she felt her heart flare in its dark cave, hungry and blind. So there is energy and there's anger and frustration there, which is desperate for release, but it doesn't quite make it outside. It is not released in the case of this poor character. Moving around to our penultimate quote here, still looking at the character of Mrs. Mackay, we see lots of examples now of things being released, not in that kind of jubilant way of joy and kind of exciting release that is beneficial, more to do with pain and emotion, I think here. So if we look here, we see in that third line down, she's out for a walk at night. Her breath swaggered away like a genie popped from a flask. Again, this isn't this kind of joyous release that we are seeing from the pupils or Miss Bath and Miss Fife earlier. If you look a bit further down as well, she notices that the students had laughed for weeks now. Panic nipped and salted her eyes. So we're getting the idea of release here, absolutely. But we are seeing it in the form of tears which shone on her cheeks. So this is a release, not so much a beneficial, enabling or liberating one, but more to do with the pain she is experiencing. We also see an important juxtaposition here in the case of Mrs. Mackay. There's the idea of letting in here. It's almost as if the night is a surrogate or replacement lover, providing the intimacy that her husband no longer provides for her. If you notice, we will see that she's letting the night sigh underneath her clothes, perfume her skin, letting it in the scented night. That contrasts with how the husband is tactile when he's having his morning egg. So you'll notice that he appeared requesting a 4-minute egg from a satisfied hen. I think the idea being here is that Mrs. Mackay has gone for a long time without being satisfied by her husband. He dips in his toast. You can see that's quite phallic and penetrative, savouring the soft gold of the yolk with his neat tongue. And then you come back up to the top and you see how the night is showing more attention and more physical intimacy with Mrs. Mackay than her husband. So this obviously is in advance of when she gives herself to the night and goes for a walk and doesn't come back towards the end of the poem. So we're seeing images of repression here and a form of release, but not leading to a successful or triumphant ending for this character. Finally, on this, we move to a controversial part of the poem, where we're looking at Miss Dunn and the relationship which develops between her and the captain of the sports team, Diana Kim. So we have here another example of nature imagery. Something inside her, this is referring to Diana Kim, I think, although it could be seen as quite ambiguous. Something inside her opened and bloomed. Miss Dunn was her destiny, fame, a strong hand pulling her higher and higher into the far Tibetan clouds, into the sun. So we're seeing obviously the nature of same-sex desire emerge here. The reference to Into the Sun alludes to the Icarus myth and obviously foreshadows the ending of the poem, which we'll discuss later, whether you see it as a tragic ending or a happy ending with sort of two people in love and in a state of bliss, even though they're plummeting towards their death. But more on that later. Finally then, on this one, in terms of release and release from repression, we have the idea of adventure and escape clearly here. So there was a girl who would scale a vertical wall of ice. So there's that breaking free of confinement. And of course you see the idea of hearing her outline the journey, the great adventure, the climb, to the Mother of Earth. Definitely all relating to ideas of escape and breaking the confines of Stafford Girls' High School. Moving on to 2 of 5. Number 2 of 5 in our language analysis. Here we're looking at a second pattern of language associated with nature imagery, taking the form of water, wind, and also flowering, a little bit we saw earlier with Geraldine Ruth's throat. Okay, so before we go around and look at some quotations in close detail, let's ask ourselves why Carol Ann Duffy may have chosen to represent laughter metaphorically and symbolically in nature language. Well, here are some possible reasons. First of all, this laughter, extended metaphor for feminism, see the context video, is being represented as an unstoppable power and force. Who can stand in the way of a tidal wave or an earthquake? So definitely a really effective vehicle to put across that idea of power and force of feminism. Secondly, you can also think about nature imagery representing the laughter as natural, as of nature. So these instinctive urges and forces need to be released. We've just spoken about repression in the previous slide, so it is natural to release these forces, and on the whole, this poem shows it's mostly beneficial to release this laughter of feminism. Thirdly, you can also link this nature imagery to the archetypal figure of Mother Nature. This is a figure who tends to float across many of the poems in feminine gospels. If you look at Loud, you'll see the female character's voice represented as a storm, which descends from the heavens into the world, trying to solve it and improve it and remove it of war. Also in this poem, on the previous slide, you've just seen Diana Kim and Miss Dunn planning to climb to the Mother of Earth, climbing Everest. So we're seeing a sort of gynocentric or female-centric view of creation and creativity here. But definitely work with these ideas of an unstoppable power and force at work here. Moving around to our first quotation here, which is from the opening of the poem. As you can see, the topic of the lesson, this dull lesson, is the rivers of England, and you'll notice the name of one of the rivers in there is the River Lune. I suggest Duffy deliberately spikes this noun into here to raise or start to hint at the idea of lunacy, Maybe also tapping into that folkloric nonsense, the idea that the moon affects women's menstrual cycle and moods as well. Part of écriture féminine was the idea that women can often and should often write from the body as a way of challenging patriarchal language. But we do see the spread of lunacy, and that is very much celebrated in this poem as a liberating effect. You'll notice here the girls have been kept indoors, another example of repression, wet play. However, let's move to this bit where we have the laugh of Emily Jane. So the laugh there is the head noun, and we notice metaphorically that the laugh is a liquid one, a gurgle, a ripple, a dribble, a babble, a gargle. So very interesting in terms of what Caroline Duffy's doing there in terms of the rhythm of those words. We're getting towards that idea that we mentioned in the context video of this playfulness with language, the kind of rhythms and the sounds of it, given this sort of style of a female language that was posited by those theorists that we mentioned earlier in the context video. The rhythm changes again, so we've had a babble, a gargle, and then we speed the rhythm again to a plash, a splash of a laugh. So very musical sort of rhythm here, as befits the notion of an écriture féminine. We also have this interesting simile here as well. Like the laugh this is still referring to, the laugh is like the sudden jackpot leap of a silver fish in the purse of a pool. The fish imagery crops up a couple of times, I think, in the feminine Gospels. It's often used to metaphorically convey words, or the sudden gift of the right word, or the right poetical imagery. So this is a gift. If you look at jackpot, that has obviously connotations of gambling and winning. Silver has connotations of money as well. So this is a gift, this is a reward, this laughter. So clearly has a positive, beneficial presentation here. You also get that sort of reward and monetary theme continued in the purse of a pool. So obviously pool keeps our water metaphor, extended metaphor going, but keep an idea on that little sort of sub-semantic field within the water imagery, if you like. Jackpot, silver and purse. Purse and pool are obviously examples of receptacles, spaces of storage and containment, which we speak more about a little bit later on. Finally, in this very busy opening in terms of imagery, this isn't strictly speaking nature from the natural world, but we are looking at another liquid here as well. So here, fountain pen leaked. The pen being sort of symbolic of creativity, something that's very much in contrast with the style of teaching going on in this particular classroom, something to be escaped and broken free from. You'll notice other examples of repression here as well. So clamped her turquoisey hand to her mouth, but the laugh was out at large. So if you look at out and at large, you've almost got sort of criminal connotations there. At large, a menacing thing that is free from captivity. But this isn't monstrous or dangerous. It is to the school, but as we're seeing in this poem, the fact that this laughter is out there is hugely beneficial and linked to liberation. Moving around clockwise to our next quotations. So we have more in the way of water imagery here, when we see the laughter came to the boil with a brothy mirth. Important there because we'll see a receptacle quote later linked to a cauldron and witches. Duffy often takes negative female stereotypes, kind of misogynist ways of viewing women, tends to take them, embrace them, include them in her poetry, but then use them back at in a way of subverting these stereotypes, using them to present women and female endeavours and power in a more positive light. A quick mention in advance here with these particular words as well. Snigger, snicker, titter, chuckle, chortle. We'll be speaking more about these when we get to playful language, linked to that idea of jouissance and joy, when we move to a later style of language analysis. But just an initial heads up on that for now. Moving around clockwise here, more examples of this water imagery that we see on show. You have here Mrs. McKay, listening to the chaos coming in waves through the wall. Interesting sort of that we have symbolic barriers being broken down here, and you have the reference to chaos here, an abstract noun. Also picked up when we get to Mrs. Nedimbamba, where we have anarchy, the abstract noun of anarchy, roared in her face like a tropical wind. So Duffy's mixing her nature imagery here, so often we see it in the form of water, but we're also seeing it in the form of wind too. Extremely powerful forces, unstoppable forces of nature, as we mentioned earlier. Further references to the powerful force of the laughter here, more wind imagery we notice. Each girl trying to swallow the laughter down, till the sound was like a distant thunder, the opening chord of a storm. You've also got a mention elsewhere in the poem, we may see it on another quote later. Part of the lesson is the Beaufort Scale. The Beaufort Scale is used to measure strengths of wind, so we see that escalating in the poem as well. So again, this unstoppable force imagery. Another quick heads up here on these kind of Beano cartoon playful language that we'll talk more about later. The whole school guffawed. And we've got more flowering imagery as well that we've seen elsewhere. Their pink young lungs flowering more than they had for the hymn. So go back to Geraldine Ruth and their voice starting to yodel and their throat opening and blossoming. So there we have young women finding their voice in a rebellious format. Just speaking of rebellion, going back up slightly higher there, anarchy roared in her face like a tropical wind. As we put on a previous slide, Duffy's teenage years coincides with sort of late 60s, early 70s period. If you're looking at sort of anarchy and thinking about the 1970s, we could be sort of channeling an idea of sort of punk there, another form of musical rebelliousness aimed at or appealing to teenagers to smash the status quo and to rail against the establishment. So I guess historically and contextually, we're getting sort of many different periods. The late 50s of Elvis, the 60s of the Beatles, and also now the 70s, the era of punk and the Sex Pistols. So we're getting a sort of conglomeration, a kind of trans-historical, which is a very Duffy thing at times, looking at moods or women or feelings across time. So she kind of rolls all these up into a conglomeration of rebelliousness against the establishment, different decades rolled into one. Moving around clockwise again, another short little quote picking up on similar ideas. A silly joy sparked and fizzed. So this idea of silliness is extremely liberating and to be encouraged, linking into those ideas of jouissance that we mentioned in the context video. We have Tabitha Rose, the name is obviously being aptonymic with our flowering imagery and what is emerging and growing here. Ecstatic and hysterical to the point where she wet herself, wailed, wept, more tears, more bodily fluids, and metaphorically she's described as a small human shower of rain. So there's that kind of excess and tipping over, unable to contain this power, this force. Just juxtaposed in this little moment here with the bell for the start of lessons rang. Now obviously bells used to, I think they still do, ring in schools, but this is more symbolic, sort of a Pavlovian idea of trying to control. If you think about the notion of school, you wear uniforms to establish uniformity. A bell is rang to order you and control you and dictate what you should do and when you should be somewhere. This bell is now rendered obsolete and almost meaningless in the face of this chaos and emerging rebellion. Just to reinforce that, even though the bell rang, we get told here, somehow the school filed out in a raggedy line. So that adjective is super important for saying, ring all the bells you want, have all the attempts to brace and control that you would like, school's out for summer. Rebellion has won. Finally, moving round into this last quote here, we see the character of Dr. Bream, the head of school, an interesting figure who we'll return to later on. Remember we said how on the whole, not exclusively or totally or completely, the effects of this laughter/feminism is enabling and liberating for most people in the poem. Not so for Dr. Bream. We'll see her ending later on. So we must be careful not to claim that all members and all characters in this poem have that liberation and that joyful freedom. So we've got a few more quick instances of repression there, almost denial there from Dr. Bream. Dr. Bream kept her eyes clenched. She's trying not to look and trying to start and establish a fresh start here. This fails, miserably, disastrously, and instead we get the tide of their mirth, their shoals, their glittering laughter, the giggling sea. So more of that kind of water imagery. The thing I do want to zoom in particular here is, but the girls were hysterical, watching the head, Queen Canute, singing against the tide of their mirth. So there's an allusion to the mythological figure of King Canute, who apparently was so convinced of his own regal power that he marched into the sea and tried to command the tide to stop. Obviously that only went one way. He failed. So I think that's an interesting sort of historical allusion or use of myth there. Again, another typical Duffy feature. Dr. Bream is Queen Canute. She cannot and will not hold this tide, this force of nature, of the emerging hysteria and rebellion, and ultimately, you have to say, victory over this establishment. Moving on to part 3 of 5 of our language analysis. Okay, our third area of language interest. So we're looking at subversion, challenging power, challenging the system through something called reappropriation. Now, if you're not familiar with this, at a very simple level, it just means taking something back used against you, maybe an insult, a slur, a negative stereotype, taking that and using it back at those who would use it to sort of belittle you or present you in a negative or stereotypical way. In this poem, we're seeing a lot of the education that is imposed and inflicted upon the young girls, used back at the establishment, usually in a way which signals victory. So if we move around to our first example of this, again it's from the early part of the poem, we notice how the note, whatever's on that note we never get to learn, has been furtively opened, the folded note which contains the joke which starts the laughter, and it is torn from the back of the King James Bible, and people laughed out loud. So very important that we have a sort of the source of the humour, the origins of it, being torn from the book of faith here in this school, which would be a Christian school. So no respect for that, and it's very, very poignant and powerful that the note and the joke which triggers all of this comes from something which is shown no reverence or respect whatsoever. This would have been used to help instill certain values and expectations of the girls in this school, but as we said, the source of this humour which destroys the establishment comes from something which is disrespectfully torn from the Bible. Moving around to our next quote to show an example of reappropriation used to achieve subversion. We have had a previous moment where one of the teachers is teaching from Anthony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare play, but we have here the figure of Caroline Joan, who is described as the class clown, who stood on a desk and took up the speech where Mrs. Mackay had left off. lend me your ears, etc., etc. We could look at ears as another example of receptacles, more on that very soon. But we see the reference to Henry Pye, which is obviously hilarious when you're in a joking mood. And Caroline Joan belted out Anthony's speech in an Elvis style. For Brutus is an honourable man, thank you very much. Okay, so again, there's that lack of reverence. What has been imposed upon them has been taken, stolen, and reused in a subversive way to undermine and challenge and ultimately destroy the system. This is obviously the cause of much hilarity, Caroline Joan doing Shakespeare in an Elvis style. A quick contextual point there in terms of juxtaposition. We've seen this quote earlier, but we have Miss Nadine Bamber. No fan of rock and roll could scarcely believe her ears. So I guess what's implied here is that Miss Nadine Bamber is appalled at the lack of respect shown towards the bard, Shakespeare, the kind of reverence and worship he is afforded. No, to Caroline Joan, it's just a chance to mess around and transform Shakespeare into Elvis. Moving around to our third quote here, this one is quite subtle and won't become maybe fully clear until we look at the language of authority clashing with the language of playfulness a little bit later on. But we have here a moment where we say, but the crowd of girls gave a massive cheer, stamping the floor with their feet in a rebel beat. So, linked to this idea of Shakespeare, we'll see later how a lot of the female teachers, before they are liberated by this laughter and this anarchy and this chaos, this almost military language of regimentation, drumming and beating, not the students, but drumming their learning into them, this passive learning. By this stage, though, in this particular quote we're looking at now, it's almost like the drumming and the repetitive nature of the teaching that has been drummed into them. Again, they've reappropriated that, they've taken that and absorbed it and are using that back at their sort of oppressors and to subvert the order. So the stamping with the rebel beat is another example of reappropriation to claim power over. Also, it's not seen in the poem, but you could maybe make a connection here with all for one, someone yelled, and one for all. Perhaps this was a work of something in literature class from the Three Musketeers that has been inflicted upon them also. But again, it's their learning used back at their oppressors to rebel against them. Quick mention here as well of the names of one of the female students, Emmeline Bell. Could be a little nod or allusion towards Emmeline Pankhurst, and I'm guessing that's a surname of Bell, sorry, a middle name of Bell, beg your pardon, but obviously we have beautiful Emmeline, so if we were in any doubt about the nods towards the importance and the presence of feminism in this poem, I think that's being removed or put to bed there. A further example of using what is inflicted upon them back at their teachers. So we have Senora devises plans to return to Spain. Cries of "Ole!" Again, learning used back at those who inflicted this awful learning upon them. Miss Prendergast is joining the Theatre Royale. A round of applause, as you would do in a theatre. We have very witty students here, so it's not on the curriculum, wit and being sassy and funny and cheeky, but my goodness, they're extremely good at it. And of course the round of applause crashed on the boards like surf. There's our water metaphor again. Just a little heads up in advance, there's the mention of marched from the stage, that military sort of routine and regimentation, but more of that later. And finally in this section, again more examples of reappropriation. This particular moment of the poem sees Dr. Bream, the head, leave the school, so another sign of their defeat and the victory of the girls. So another mention from Caroline Joan, this is obviously a catchphrase now, she's an Elvis fan, so when the head leaves, another sign of their victory. Elvis has left the building. So Again, there's kind of the rock and roll, the kind of newer generation, showing their victory and how victorious they are over the older generation. More nature imagery, a cheer like an avalanche bounced off the roof. The girls burst into song. Now, this song here is one of the hymns that has been inflicted on them, expected of them, to go with this kind of King James Christian ethos of the school. They will have had to sing this in every assembly as a matter of routine and regimentation. But this is not the same as previous singing. So the girls burst into song of the song Jerusalem as their mute teachers. They've been defeated, they have been silenced, they walk away in defeat, they walk from the stage. And then we get the line from Jerusalem, which the girls are presumably singing. I'm not going to sing. A daft Elvis voice is quite enough, thank you. We have till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, beg your pardon. So that pronoun I think is different now. Till we have built Jerusalem. Previously they will have been expected to sing that as a school, as a corps, or one body, embodying the beliefs of Stafford Girls High. The we now excludes the teachers. The we is inclusive only of the younger generation. And this reference to building Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, this is not the Jerusalem that the institution will have had in mind. This is the New World Order. This is the younger generation building and shaping the current and future England. So, very good examples of reappropriation there, particularly that last one. They are the exact same words of Jerusalem. However, they are imbued or invested with an entirely other or different sentiment or feeling behind them. Okay, our fourth of 5 language areas we're looking at. Our fourth one here is concerned with looking at playful language, which is juxtaposed with the language of authority as displayed by the teachers. Okay, so let's be more specific. What kinds and types of playful language are we concerned with here? First of all is something I'm going to call Beano-esque or cartoonish language. If you're familiar with the Beano, it's not quite become extinct yet, but we'll look at some particular examples in a moment of sort of Dennis the Menace, Walter the Softy kind of language, which I think is used consciously here by Caroline Duffy. We've also got some kind of poetic language. I guess that sounds obvious, and what is a poem after all, but some of this kind of poetic flair is consciously used in the poem, as we'll look at in a moment, and we'll consider why. Sort of Caroline Duffy showing off her ability. I think that's included to maybe suggest that even though she suffered this boring rote learning at school, her poetic talent and her immense skill kind of developed in spite of all of this. So maybe there's a little sort of indebtedness there to say, you pretty much ruined and gave me a miserable experience of education, but somehow out of that I still emerged an amazing poet. We also have some examples of smutty innuendo in here too, which is linked to this hilarity that spreads throughout the school. But all of this is juxtaposed against the language of authority. I suppose you might say attempts at authority, given how they are deeply unsuccessful here in the face of this overwhelming hilarity. Moving around to our first examples of this, again back at the early part of the poem. So we highlighted some of these earlier when we looked at some of these words like snigger or snicker or titter or chuckle or chortle. These are words which are very, very typical of the Beano or the dandy or comics of those eras. You tend to get, again, naughty, rebellious characters in there who defy authority. So Dennis the Menace would be the classic one. Cared nothing for rules, and was deeply, deeply subversive and naughty, to use the correct term of the era. So we're getting that sort of rebelliousness coming through in that Beano language associated with playfulness and subversion. We've also got some use of a different kind of idiom here slipped in amongst all this mirth and humour. So again, this is maybe Caroline Duffy showcasing her wonderful ear for language and her ability to sort of change voices within any given stanza at any given moment. So if you look a little bit here, we start changing to what sounds like to me football commentary when the note is dropped, and we have the joke to the floor and kicked it across to Jennifer Kay, who snorted and towed it to Marjorie May, who splattered and heeled it backwards to Jessica Kate. So I'm trying to take on the voice there of like a football commentary of the 1960s on the BBC or the 1970s. So just because she can, Caroline Duffy just resorts to this kind of commentary idiom, maybe also to show the skills of the girls as well in terms of their sporting ability and to hide the note that's the cause of the trouble from the teacher and the authority here. In contrast to this, we move across to a moment here from some of the teachers demonstrating their attempt at authority. I think that's more relevant and more accurate to say now. I want to zoom in on Miss Fife here, and it's important now to acknowledge her name and how it's aptonymic. So a fife is a small high-pitched wind instrument similar to the piccolo. It's used in a military marching band, so you tend to have a fife and drum corps. So with that idea of military associated with their name and references to drumming, we're going to see this kind of idea of regimentation and not quite military school. That's a very different sort of concept, but this school is run along those militaristic lines where they want to drum and train obedient and dutiful people. Obviously that goes spectacularly wrong in this poem, or it goes wrong as a consequence of too much control or attempt to control. So you can see here Miss Fife, whose name is aptonymic. She thundered, she strode, she snatched, quite violent and aggressive. She jabbed here with the chalk and slashed out a word of silence on the board. So there's that kind of oppressive and forceful sense of authority. However, juxtaposed against that, we have more of our Beano language, our hollered, our hooted, and our howled. So this stands no chance. It's still, the teachers are reasonably successful here at stifling and controlling, but obviously that success is very limited and does not last. As you can see, this bit ends here with Stephanie Fay started to laugh. We also have that mention of the Beaufort Scale, measuring the degree of gales and gale force winds. So there's our nature imagery we mentioned earlier. We also got Miss Bat droned on. So again, this is not interesting to listen to, is this lesson. Reinforcing this military idea, we have Mrs. Mackay here trying to get, or helping the girls trying to get Shakespeare by heart to the beat of the ruler of Mrs. Mackay. So there's something that links and reinforces that idea of fife and drums. This is not education, this is rote learning, where you have to remember stuff and you are trained and conditioned into remembering and knowing. There's no independence of thought, there's no creativity, there's no freedom. But that's the point here. This is something that Caroline Duffy is very critical of, particularly in a poem called Head of English as well, and various other forms of what she sees as an awful way to educate young minds. Finally, on this idea of regimentation, the teachers, we are told, sat at assembly in solemn rows. So there's your regimentation and your routine and lack of individuality again. Our final quote on this is kind of very self-explanatory, and I'm not going to explain the joke to the point where I embarrass myself, but you have a new teacher here, bless her, Mrs. Monroe, who is new to all of this. Why there's a new teacher, it's never quite stated. Perhaps the implied idea is that someone has been the first to jump ship and leave, but poor Mrs. Monroe walks into this situation and she's reading something called The Flaying of Marsyas, which contains the lines, "Why are you stripping me from myself?" The girls were in fits. It was possible to count his throbbing organs and the chamber of his lungs, shrieks and squeals, and then just after that you get the 9 major planets, Jupiter, Saturn and Uranus. Pandemonium hooted and whooped. Now, okay, so we have the innuendo there and how attempts at learning are failing miserably here in this climate of hysteria and rebellion. But just within that you see those 2 questions. Why? At what? And then just previous to that, going against the sort of order of things, we have we can all share the joke. And again, regularly in the poem, you see what's so funny, what's the joke, just reinforcing the idea that these teachers are not part of the group. They are excluded at present from the hilarity and sort of the spread of feminism and liberation. They are not in on the joke. They have to sort of tune into it. There's a nice little metaphor elsewhere in the poem as well, where one of the teachers is described as tuning into herself just before the moment where they decide to leave and the school closes. So this does raise the idea of a frequency of tuning into sort of a feminist message, or the liberating possibilities of this ideology and this belief. I guess what this brings us to overall is the idea of generational conflict. So the Dr. Breen and the tragic end of her in the poem, she seems to be immune from or inoculated against it. She's presumably one of the older members of staff, so this hilarity, this spread of feminism does not touch her. She looks at her achievements, which are behind glass, and she ends up looking at her closed school from a hospital wing. The slightly younger teachers go off and do various different activities throughout the world, different sense of vocations and life choices, but obviously the youngest girls, the pupils, they're awash with this hilarity. So feminism having different effects upon the different generations here in the poem. Okay, our final language area here, our 5th of 5, is looking at receptacle or vessel imagery. And this is a motif, a recurring pattern of repeated imagery across the entire collection of feminine gospels. I guess where this stems from, or originates from, is again from a very misogynist context. Going back to sort of biblical presentations of women as sort of empty vessels, as an empty space. That's also mirrored in Freudian psychology as well, towards the start of the 20th century, where he describes women as having a lack, an emptiness, which can only be satisfied by a man or a baby put in there by a man. So that's very sort of negative stereotypes and extremely dismissive of women as empty spaces or vessels which need filling. But, as we've mentioned, and is just typical of Caroline Duffy, she takes negative stereotypes, embraces them, and shows the reverse and subverts them. So instead what we see in the feminine gospels tends to be the power of such vessels and receptacles or containers. So if you look in Loud, we have a loud woman whose mouth and her cry threatens to engulf and devour all worldly conflict. Imagine a world removed of conflict and war. So there's powerful and world-changing and world-improving. Similarly, in The Light Gatherer, we see the baby being cared for and cradled and loved in the receptacle of the mother's arms, holding the baby's glowing feet in her hands, all these kinds of things. So we have very powerful receptacles that are loving, world-healing, powerful, conquering over men. There's a part in Beautiful where Mark Antony has gone to Cleopatra's tent, her boudoir it's described as, and he puts his tongue in her mouth and he is rendered dumb because he is kissing this beautiful queen. So quite the opposite of passivity and helplessness and uselessness. Receptacles are reappropriated, as we mentioned earlier, and used to show tremendous female power. Moving across to our first one here, again we've looked at this in different guises, but we are revisiting here, and there are other examples of course. This is designed to get you rereading the poems, seeing more. These are always the purpose of these language videos on Lit in 5. So we have clamped a turquoisey hand to her mouth, so we see lots of cavities and sort of bodily orifices, I guess, that are struggling to contain. So we had the student who wet herself, and tears emerging from the sort of cavity of the eyes and the tear duct. We've also got the fountain pen leaking here. So we have this idea of receptacles overflowing, and this is again very natural and necessary in a poem where liberation is needed and is brought about. Moving across, we have the noise here described as a cauldron of noise, and we have the noise and the laughter which explode through the nose. So there's another cavity struggling to contain this natural hysteria which must be released and brings about massive and beneficial change when released. Obviously linking cauldron there to cackling, so maybe there's another sort of negative female stereotype of the witch identity being alluded to or nodded to here. But again, this is not a negative portrayal. All the benefits we are seeing in this poem of letting out this hysteria. A nice little further take on the idea of receptacles here as well. So Miss Bat is asking what's so amusing, Stephanie Fay. Yet another instance of these teachers not yet getting the joke, not tuned into the frequency of this laughter. And then we have one wag, Angela Joy, who popped her head in the jaws of her desk and bellowed, "What's so amusing? What's so amusing?" into its musty yawn. So there's a receptacle there, a container, an empty container. So again, that's not a negative female stereotype. What this actually does, I guess, is allows Angela Joy to amplify her joke, which is at the teachers and at the expense of authority. So there's their voice being amplified, and again just lends to the increasing and swelling hysteria here. Moving round here to a slightly different take on receptacles and vessels, and this is from the point of view of the teachers now and the change they undergo in their poem. So I also want to link this to the idea that the classic sort of thing that lots of Duffy's poetry tends to explore, not just this poem, the difference between public identity and public sphere and public self, and private identity and private sphere and self. So we have here the sort of socially acceptable, the socially permitted. The women teachers of England slept in their beds, their shrewd or wise or sensible heads, safe vessels for Othello's jealousy, the wife of Bath's warm laugh. Read the wife of Bath in the context of feminism as well. A brilliant piece of writing by Chaucer. And then there's this huge list, an impressive list. Look at all the knowledge and talent and know-how and academic skill these women possess. But I think that's a little bit, deliberately so, a little bit patronising. Safe vessels. I think that's patronising language to show that it deserves more respect and more reverence, that these women are sort of the purveyors of education who train young minds. Then what we get, however, are what appears to be, or starts to see, a number of dreams here now. So the safe vessels, that's fine, that's their public selves, which is socially approved of. But then through our third person omniscience we move to a different receptacle or space. Miss Dunn dreamed of a freezing white terrain where slowly moving elephants were made of ice. I'm not a dream analyst or an expert in that sense, but perhaps that's sort of metaphorical for how she and other members of staff feel in this institution. A slowly moving elephant made of ice, sort of frozen kept still in captivity, in deep freeze, if you like, before they sort of crack through and emerge and become their own people. Then in this sort of private space, this private sphere, Miss Nadine Bamber dreams she knelt to kiss Miss Barrett on her couch. So we're seeing this idea of an interior space and a private self which starts to emerge and finally be acknowledged in the poem. A final take on receptacles here, or vessels. We have a moment here where Miss Fife is having a nightmare. It's got another dream that we have here. Miss Fife dreamed that the school was a huge ship floating away from land, so all at sea, deserted, astray, all hands lost, steered by a ghost, a woman whose face was the head's. So nightmarish stuff here. And then we have a little vision of all the other staff, and then this ellipsis here as she drifts back to consciousness and wakes up. She woke in the darkness, a face over hers, a warm mouth, there's a receptacle there, kissing the gibberish from her lips, with the result being the school sank in her mind, a black wave taking it down as she gazed at the woman's face. So obviously this is her lover, Miss Bat, another teacher at the school. So I guess what we're seeing here in a different sort of take on things is a healing, soothing and loving receptacle to sort of soothe away the pain that working at this school has had on Miss Fife. Clearly she is having a nightmare about it. So when she awakes from that and her horrible nightmarish dream, there's another sort of receptacle there in terms of her partner who soothes and sort of kisses that away. So not just that empty space and that useless receptacle or vessel which requires filling or populating. Okay, a very lengthy video there on a very lengthy but brilliant poem. I hope you found the content useful, particularly those 5 areas of language analysis. If you have found it useful, as ever, please add your likes, subscribe to the channel, and leave some helpful comments underneath the videos.